The sun hung low in the sky as Elliot and I arrived in Blackwater Creek, painting the landscape in hues of amber and gold. The town's air was thick with humidity, pressing down on us as if the swamp itself wanted to keep its secrets hidden. The road leading in was lined with old oak trees, their branches stretching out like ancient sentinels guarding the path. Spanish moss dripped from their limbs, swaying gently in the warm breeze. It felt as though we were stepping into a place where time had slowed to a crawl, where the weight of the past lingered in the very air. Elliot, as always, looked entirely unfazed by our surroundings. Dressed in his usual tailored suit, he adjusted his hat and took a deep breath, his sharp gray eyes scanning the town with an intensity that never ceased to impress me. I, on the other hand, felt the unease creeping in almost immediately. There was something about Blackwater Creek that made my skin crawl, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. We parked near the town square, a modest space dominated by a weathered fountain that no longer seemed to function. A few locals lingered nearby, their conversations falling silent as they turned to observe us with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Elliot stepped out of the car, his movements deliberate and unhurried, and I followed suit, feeling the crunch of gravel beneath my shoes. "Quaint little place," I said, attempting to lighten the mood. "Reminds me of something out of a Faulkner novel." Elliot's lips quirked in the faintest hint of a smile. "Let's hope it doesn't end the same way." With that, he began walking toward the sheriff's office, leaving me to trail behind. The building was a squat structure of red brick, its facade bearing the marks of age and neglect. The sign above the door read "Sheriff's Office" in peeling white letters. Inside, the air was slightly cooler but carried the stale smell of old paper and faintly of sweat. Sheriff McAllister, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a face etched with lines of worry, greeted us with a firm handshake. "Detective Brooks," he said, his voice gruff but respectful. "And you must be Mr. Vasquez." "Just Miguel," I replied, offering a polite smile. "Appreciate you two coming out here," McAllister said, gesturing for us to take a seat. His office was sparsely decorated, with a few framed photographs on the wall and a worn wooden desk cluttered with papers. He leaned back in his chair, his expression a mix of weariness and frustration. "We're not exactly used to this kind of thing around here." Elliot pulled out his notebook, flipping it open with a practiced ease. "Sheriff, why don't you start by walking us through the details of the case?" McAllister nodded, running a hand over his jaw as he collected his thoughts. "3 murders in the last 2 months," he began. "All of them happened near Blackwater Creek. The victims, a young woman, a farmhand, and a traveling salesman, were found brutally killed. Throats slashed, bodies left out in the open like some kind of sick display." He paused, his gaze hardening. "There's talk in town about ghosts. Some folks think it's the spirit of a slave who was wronged back in the plantation days. They say she's come back to take revenge." I exchanged a glance with Elliot, who remained impassive. "And what do you think, Sheriff?" I asked. McAllister exhaled sharply. "I think it's nonsense, but I also know how fear can spread like wildfire, especially in a place like this. People are jumpy, looking over their shoulders. I need this solved, and I need it solved fast." Elliot nodded, his pen moving swiftly across the page as he jotted down notes. "We'll need access to the crime scenes and any reports your deputies have filed," he said. "And I'd like to speak with anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual." The sheriff hesitated for a moment, then reached into a drawer and pulled out a set of keys. He slid them across the desk toward Elliot. "These are for an old fishing shack by the creek. That's where the last victim was found. But be careful out there. It's easy to get lost, and the swamp doesn't take kindly to strangers." Elliot pocketed the keys and stood, extending a hand to the sheriff. "Thank you, Sheriff. We'll do our best to get to the bottom of this." As we left the office, the setting sun cast long shadows across the town. The air seemed heavier now, almost oppressive, as if Blackwater Creek itself was watching us. Elliot led the way back to the car, his expression unreadable. I could tell his mind was already working, piecing together the fragments of information we'd been given. The drive to the fishing shack was uneventful, the road narrowing as we ventured deeper into the swamp. The trees grew denser, their gnarled branches forming a canopy that filtered the fading light. The sound of cicadas filled the air, their rhythmic buzz creating an almost hypnotic backdrop. When we finally arrived, the shack appeared before us like something out of a dream or a nightmare. It was a small, weathered structure perched on stilts above the muddy ground, its wooden planks warped and discolored by years of exposure to the elements. The surrounding area was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant croak of a frog. Elliot stepped out of the car, his gaze sweeping over the scene. "Stay close," he said, his tone calm but firm. I followed him up the rickety steps to the shack's entrance. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit interior that smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic. The floorboards groaned under our weight as we stepped inside, the sound echoing in the confined space. "This is where they found the last victim," Elliot said, his voice low. He gestured to a dark stain on the floor, a chilling reminder of the violence that had taken place here. I swallowed hard, my stomach turning at the sight. "Any idea what we're looking for?" "Anything that doesn't belong," Elliot replied, already moving to examine the corners of the room. His movements were precise, almost methodical, as he searched for clues. I tried to follow his lead, though my unease made it difficult to focus. The shadows seemed to shift and dance in the dim light, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, set my nerves on edge. "Here," Elliot said suddenly, breaking the silence. He crouched near the far wall, holding up a small object for me to see. It was a charm of some kind, crudely fashioned from twine and bits of bone. "Black magic," he murmured, his tone betraying a hint of distaste. I knelt beside him, examining the charm with a mixture of curiosity and dread. "You think someone's using these to scare people?" "Possibly," Elliot said, slipping the charm into his pocket. "Or to hide something far worse." We spent the next hour combing the shack and its surroundings, but the unease lingered. As we made our way back to the car, the swamp seemed to close in around us, its dark waters reflecting the fading light of the sky. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, though I saw no sign of anyone, or anything, out there. Elliot, as always, remained calm and composed, his focus unshaken. "The creek holds its secrets well," he said quietly as we drove away. "But every secret leaves a trace." I nodded, though a part of me wondered if some secrets were better left undisturbed. The drive back to town was cloaked in silence, the only sound the low hum of the car engine as it navigated the winding dirt road. Elliot sat rigid in the driver's seat, his hands light but steady on the wheel, his eyes fixed straight ahead. I could tell his mind was already dissecting the fragments of evidence we'd found at the shack. As for me, my thoughts were far less clinical. The image of that crude charm lingered in my mind like a splinter I couldn't dislodge. It wasn't the first time we'd come across signs of ritualistic practices in a case, but there was something about this one that felt raw, primitive, dangerous. The sky had faded to a deep indigo by the time we rolled into the heart of Blackwater Creek. Streetlights flickered to life, their dim amber glow casting long shadows across the uneven sidewalks. The town seemed quieter than before, as if the weight of the swamp's secrets had settled over its streets. I caught sight of a figure peering out from behind a lace curtain as we passed, their face hidden in shadow. It was a brief glimpse, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. We pulled up to the modest inn where we were staying, its peeling white paint and sagging porch giving it a weary charm. The innkeeper, Mrs. Tate, greeted us with a curt nod as we stepped inside. She was a severe woman with iron-gray hair pulled back into a tight bun, her eyes sharp and untrusting. She barely spoke beyond what was necessary, but I got the distinct impression that she saw more than she let on. "Evenin'," she said, her voice clipped as she handed us the key to our room. "You boys find what you were looking for?" "Not yet," Elliot replied smoothly, offering her one of his disarming smiles. "But we're getting closer." Mrs. Tate muttered something under her breath that I couldn't quite catch, then turned and disappeared into the back room. Elliot raised an eyebrow at me but said nothing, and we made our way upstairs to our room. It was a small space, sparsely furnished but clean. A single window overlooked the main street, its glass smudged and slightly warped. I sank onto the edge of the bed with a sigh, rubbing the back of my neck. "Does she strike you as odd?" I asked, glancing at Elliot as he unpacked his notebook and photographs from his bag. "Everyone here strikes me as odd," he replied without looking up. "This town is steeped in fear, Miguel. Fear of the swamp, fear of the past, fear of the truth." I couldn't argue with that. Blackwater Creek felt like a place frozen in time, its people trapped beneath the weight of their own histories. It was a kind of fear I'd seen before, but rarely so pervasive. Elliot spread the photographs out on the small table by the window, his brow furrowed in concentration. I joined him, leaning over to examine the images of the victims and the crime scenes. The wounds were brutal, the kind that spoke of rage and control in equal measure. But it was the charm, the twisted bundle of bone and twine, that drew my attention once again. "What do you think it means?" I asked, nodding toward the photograph of the charm. "Hard to say," Elliot replied, his tone thoughtful. "It could be a red herring, something meant to mislead us. Or it could be a symbol of power, a way for the killer to assert control over their victims." He tapped the photograph with his pen. "Either way, it's deliberate. This wasn't left behind by accident." A knock at the door interrupted our discussion. Elliot straightened, his eyes narrowing slightly as he moved to answer it. I reached instinctively for the small knife I kept in my pocket, a habit I'd picked up during our investigations. You could never be too careful. The door creaked open to reveal a young woman, her face pale and pinched, her dark eyes darting nervously between us. She was dressed plainly, her brown hair pulled back into a loose ponytail. "Detective Brooks?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Elliot replied, his tone calm but alert. "And you are?" "Marjorie," she said, glancing over her shoulder as if to ensure she hadn't been followed. "Marjorie Grant. I heard you were looking into the murders." Elliot stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. She hesitated for a moment before crossing the threshold, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. "You've got some information for us?" Elliot prompted as he closed the door behind her. Marjorie nodded, her gaze fixed on the floor. I think I might have seen something. Out by the creek, a few nights ago." "What did you see?" Elliot asked, his voice gentle but firm. She hesitated, her eyes flicking to mine before returning to the floor. "I was walking home from a friend's house," she began, her words tumbling out in a rush. "It was late, and I shouldn't have been out there alone, but I took the path by the creek to save time. And that's when I saw it." "Saw what?" I asked, leaning forward. "A figure," she said, her voice trembling. "Tall, dressed in black. They were standing by the water, just staring. I couldn't see their face, but there was something about the way they stood. It wasn't natural." "What happened next?" Elliot pressed. Marjorie swallowed hard. "I ran. I didn't wait to see what they would do. I just ran as fast as I could." Elliot nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And you didn't tell anyone about this?" "No," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I didn't think anyone would believe me. But when I heard about you, I thought maybe you could make sense of it." Elliot exchanged a glance with me, his eyes sharp and questioning. I nodded subtly, sensing the same thing he did. There was more to Marjorie's story than she was letting on. "Thank you for coming to us," Elliot said, his tone kind but firm. "If you think of anything else, no matter how small, I need you to tell us." "Understand." Marjorie nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I just want this to be over," she whispered before turning and hurrying out of the room. Elliot closed the door behind her, his expression unreadable. "Well?" he asked, turning to me. "She's scared," I said simply, "and she's holding something back." He nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Everyone in this town is holding something back. The question is, Who's holding back what we need to know? I didn't have an answer, and neither did he. The night stretched on as we pored over the photographs and notes, the shadows outside deepening into an inky blackness. Somewhere in the distance, the mournful call of a whippoorwill echoed through the night, a haunting reminder of the swamp's ever-present watch. As I finally lay down to rest, my mind swirled with the images of the victims, the charm, and Marjorie's trembling voice. Blackwater Creek was a place of whispers and shadows, and I had the sinking feeling that we had only just begun to glimpse the darkness lurking beneath its surface. The stillness of the morning did little to settle my nerves as we headed back toward Blackwater Creek. The sun hung low in the sky, its pale rays cutting through the mist that clung to the ground like a ghostly shroud. There was something unnerving about the swamp in the early light, the way the shadows seemed to shift and twist just out of sight. Beside me, Elliot drove in silence, his hands steady on the wheel, his face carved from stone. He'd been uncharacteristically quiet since our late-night visit from Marjorie Grant, and I had the distinct feeling he was turning her story over in his mind, searching for the edges where truth and lies might separate. "Do you believe her?" I asked finally, breaking the long silence. Elliot didn't look at me, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "I believe she saw something," he said after a moment. "Whether it's what she claimed, that remains to be seen." I nodded, though his answer did little to quell my unease. There was something in Marjorie's eyes last night, a fear so raw it was impossible to fake. But I'd learned not to let my instincts cloud my judgment, especially in cases like this. Fear could make people see things that weren't there, just as it could blind them to what was right in front of them. We reached the edge of the creek a little before 8. The air was still cool, though the sun promised another sweltering day ahead. The swamp looked different in the daylight, its dark waters glinting like polished glass beneath the shifting canopy of trees. The oppressive weight of the previous night had lessened, but there was still an unmistakable sense of foreboding about the place, a feeling that we were intruding on something ancient and unknowable. Elliot parked the car and stepped out, his movements fluid and purposeful. He carried with him the small leather bag he always used for fieldwork, its contents meticulously organized and ready for any eventuality. I followed him to the water's edge, where the ground turned soft and spongy beneath our feet. "We'll start here," Elliot said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Keep an eye out for anything unusual. Tracks, markings, disturbed vegetation." I nodded and we began our search. The swamp was alive with sound, the hum of insects and the occasional call of a bird creating a symphony of nature that was almost hypnotic. But beneath it all, there was a stillness, a sense of watchfulness that sent shivers down my spine. It didn't take long to find our first clue. A few yards from the water's edge, Elliot crouched down beside a cluster of broken reeds. He reached out, his gloved fingers brushing lightly against the ground. "Someone's been here recently," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "The reeds are trampled, the soil disturbed. Whoever it was, they were heavy, likely a man." I watched as he examined the area, his eyes darting from one detail to the next with the precision of a surgeon. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small ruler, measuring the depth of the impressions in the soil. "Boots," he muttered. "Size 11, I'd guess. The tread patterns distinct, military surplus, or something similar. Could be a hunter," I suggested, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. There was no reason for anyone to be out here, not this deep in the swamp and not at this hour. "Possibly," Elliot said, though his tone made it clear he wasn't convinced. He stood, brushing the dirt from his hands, and glanced toward the creek. "Let's keep moving." We followed the trail as best we could, though it grew fainter the farther we went. The soft ground gave way to patches of water, forcing us to tread carefully as we navigated the maze of roots and branches that threatened to trip us at every turn. The air grew thick with the smell of decaying vegetation, a pungent reminder of the swamp's slow, relentless cycle of life and death. It was Elliot who found the next clue. We'd stopped to catch our breath near a cluster of cypress trees when he spotted something glinting in the sunlight. He reached down and pulled it from the muck, a small, rusted knife, its blade stained with something dark. Blood? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Most likely, Elliot said, turning the blade over in his hands. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wrapped the knife carefully before slipping it into his bag. We'll have it tested when we get back to town. I nodded, though my mind was already racing. The knife was old, its handle worn smooth from years of use. Whoever had left it here hadn't done so by accident. Of that I was certain. It felt like a message, a warning left for anyone who might come too close to uncovering the truth. The trail ended abruptly a short while later, the footprints disappearing into a patch of water that stretched out like a mirror beneath the trees. Elliot stood at the edge, his eyes scanning the surface with a look of quiet determination. Whoever they were, they knew this swamp well, he said finally. They're using it to cover their tracks. Or to lead us into a trap, I said, my voice low. Elliot turned to me, his expression unreadable. Perhaps, he said, but a trap, Miguel, is only as effective as the prey it catches. I wasn't sure if he meant to reassure me, but it didn't work. The swamp was beginning to feel like a living thing, its dark waters and tangled roots conspiring to keep us from finding the answers we sought. As we made our way back to the car, the sun climbed higher in the sky, its heat pressing down on us like a physical weight. The sounds of the swamp grew louder, the hum of insects nearly deafening in the midday light. I could feel the sweat trickling down my back, soaking through my shirt, but I paid it no mind. My thoughts were on the knife, the tracks, and the figure Marjorie had seen by the creek. It was all starting to come together, though the picture it painted was one I wasn't sure I wanted to see. When we reached the car, Elliot paused, his hand on the door handle. There's something out here, Miguel, he said quietly. Something that doesn't want to be found. I nodded, my throat dry. Do you think we're getting close? Elliot's eyes met mine, his gaze steady and unwavering. Close, he said, but not close enough. We drove back to town in silence, the weight of the swamp's secrets heavy between us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, though whether it was by human eyes or something else entirely, I couldn't say. All I knew was that Blackwater Creek was a place of shadows, and we had only begun to scratch the surface. Elliot's boots scraped against the weathered planks of the inn's porch as he paced back and forth. I stood nearby, leaning against one of the porch's supporting beams, trying to shake off the heaviness that had been with me since the swamp. The knife, wrapped neatly and stashed in Elliot's bag, was a silent reminder of what we were up against, though neither of us had put it into words. Yet, you saw the sheriff's face when we mentioned the swamp, I said finally, breaking the tense quiet. You think he knows more than he's letting on? Of course he does, Elliot replied, his voice carrying a note of certainty that left no room for doubt. McAllister isn't the type to spook easily, but I'd wager that swamp has him sleeping with one eye open. I nodded, the sinking sensation in my chest deepening. Blackwater Creek was a web of secrets, and every thread we pulled seemed to tighten the noose. The door behind us creaked open, and Mrs. Tate stepped out, a tray balanced expertly in her hands. 2 glasses of iced tea rattled softly against the tray's wooden surface as she approached. Thought you boys might need something to cool off, she said, her voice gruff but not unkind. She placed the tray on the small table between us and gave me a pointed look. Keeping him out of trouble, are ya? I managed a weak smile. Doing my best. She didn't linger. With a nod to Elliot, she turned and retreated into the inn, leaving us alone once more. Elliot picked up one of the glasses and studied it for a moment, his expression unreadable. She's afraid too, he said after taking a long sip. Everyone in this town is. Fear's contagious, I said, watching the way the sunlight caught the condensation on my glass. It spreads faster than truth and lingers longer than reason. Elliot didn't respond. Instead, he downed the rest of his tea in one go and set the empty glass on the table with a decisive clink. We need to talk to Marjorie again, he said, already moving toward the car. She knows more than she let on last night. The Grant residence was on the outskirts of town, a modest one-story house with peeling white paint and a front yard overrun with weeds. A pair of empty rocking chairs sat on the porch, There would cracked and faded by years of sun and rain. Marjorie herself answered the door, her wide eyes immediately darting past us as though expecting someone, or something, else to be lurking in the shadows. "Miss Grant," Elliot said, his tone polite but firm, "we'd like to ask you a few more questions." She hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of the door so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Finally, she stepped aside to let us in. The house's interior was simple but clean, its furnishings worn but well kept. A faint smell of lavender lingered in the air, though it did little to mask the tension that crackled between us. Marjorie led us to the small living room and gestured for us to sit. She perched on the edge of an armchair, her posture stiff and guarded. "I already told you what I saw," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You told us part of what you saw," Elliot corrected, leaning forward slightly. "But I think there's more. Something you're afraid to say." Marjorie's hands twisted nervously in her lap. For a moment, I thought she might refuse to answer, but then she let out a shaky breath and began to speak. "It wasn't just the figure by the creek," she said, her voice trembling. "There was something else, something I heard." Elliot's eyes narrowed, his focus sharpening. "Go on." "At first, I thought it was the wind," she continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. "But it wasn't. It was like whispering. Voices, but not in any language I've ever heard. And they weren't just coming from the creek. They were everywhere. All around me." A chill ran down my spine at her words, though I tried to keep my expression neutral. Elliot, as always, remained unflappable. "Did you see anyone else?" he asked. "Anyone besides the figure by the creek?" Marjorie shook her head. "No, but I could feel something, watching me, following me." She looked up at us, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know how it sounds," she said, her voice breaking. "I know you think I'm crazy, but I swear, I'm telling the truth." Elliot leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I believe you," he said simply, "and I think you're in danger." Her eyes widened in alarm. "Danger? From who?" "That's what we're trying to figure out," Elliot said, rising to his feet. "But in the meantime, I suggest you stay inside after dark. Lock your doors, and don't open them for anyone you don't trust." Marjorie nodded, her fear palpable. As we made our way back to the car, the weight of her words hung heavy between us. Back in town, we stopped by the sheriff's office to check on the results of the blood test. McAllister greeted us with his usual gruff demeanor, though there was a flicker of unease in his eyes as he handed over the report. "The blood on that knife matches the second victim," he said, his voice low. "But there's more. Lab found traces of something else, something they couldn't identify." Elliot frowned, flipping through the report. "What do you mean, couldn't identify?" The sheriff hesitated, his gaze darting toward me before settling on Elliot. "They said it didn't match anything they've seen before. It's not human." A heavy silence fell over the room. I glanced at Elliot, searching for any sign of doubt or disbelief, but his expression remained unreadable. "Thank you, Sheriff," he said finally, tucking the report into his bag. "We'll take it from here." As we stepped outside, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the street, I couldn't hold back my questions any longer. "Not human," I said, my voice tight with disbelief. "What does that even mean?" "It means," Elliot said, his tone calm but laced with a hint of steel, "that this case is far from ordinary." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. The swamp, the whispers, the unidentified substance in the blood. It was all beginning to feel like too much. But Elliot, as always, seemed unshaken. "We need to go back to the creek," he said, his gaze distant. "There's something there we missed." And just like that, we were back in the car, heading once more toward the heart of the swamp. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever secrets Blackwater Creek held, we were getting closer to uncovering them, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know what we'd find. The road to Blackwater Creek seemed narrower this time, as if the surrounding woods were closing in, conspiring to keep us out, or perhaps keep something in. Elliot had been quiet for most of the drive, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the uneven path ahead. I could sense the storm brewing in his mind, the connections forming like invisible threads weaving into a web that only he could see. "Whatever we're chasing," I said, breaking the silence, "it doesn't want to be found." Elliot's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. "That's why we will find it," he replied, his voice resolute. The swamp greeted us as it always did, with the suffocating weight of its humid air and the ominous whispers of unseen creatures moving through the underbrush. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, warped shadows that stretched across the water like fingers reaching for something just out of reach. I stepped out of the car and immediately felt the dampness seep into my skin, the smell of decay and stagnant water wrapping around me like a shroud. Elliot didn't wait. He slung his leather satchel over his shoulder and began to make his way toward the creek. I followed close behind, trying to keep my footing on the uneven ground. The swamp was alive with sound. The croak of frogs, the buzz of insects, the distant call of a heron. But beneath it all, there was a stillness, a tension that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. We retraced our steps from the previous visit, following the faint trail of footprints and broken reeds that we had found earlier. The rusted knife, now safely tucked away in evidence, had been our first tangible clue, but it had only raised more questions. Who had left it behind? And why? Elliot stopped suddenly, crouching low to examine something on the ground. I moved to his side, peering over his shoulder at what had caught his attention. It was a fragment of fabric, dark and frayed, caught on a jagged branch. Elliot picked it up carefully, holding it up to the light. "Cotton," he said, almost to himself. "Not from modern clothing. This is old, very old." "From the same time as the legends?" I asked. "Possibly," Elliot replied, slipping the fabric into a small evidence bag. "But legends don't leave behind physical evidence. Someone is trying to make us believe in the ghost stories. Or," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "someone is trying to tell us something." Elliot's eyes met mine, his expression unreadable. "Let's keep moving." The further we went, the more oppressive the swamp seemed to become. The air grew thicker, the shadows deeper. The trail led us to a clearing surrounded by towering cypress trees, their knotted roots twisting like skeletal hands reaching out from the earth. In the center of the clearing was a makeshift altar, constructed from stones and branches. It was crude but deliberate, its surface stained dark with what looked like dried blood. Elliot approached the altar slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. He examined it closely, taking notes and photographs. I hung back, my stomach churning at the sight. There was something deeply wrong about this place, something that felt ancient and malevolent. "This isn't just for show," Elliot said, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "Someone's been performing rituals here." "What kind of rituals?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Elliot didn't respond immediately. He reached out, brushing his fingers over one of the stones. "Sacrifices," he said finally. "Blood magic." The words sent a chill down my spine. I looked around the clearing, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, half expecting to see something, or someone, watching us from the darkness. "Why here?" I asked. "What's so special about this spot?" Elliot straightened, his gaze sweeping over the clearing. "The swamp has always been a place of power," he said. "The perfect setting for someone to exploit fear and belief to their advantage." As he spoke, I noticed something glinting in the underbrush near the edge of the clearing. I moved toward it cautiously, pushing aside the leaves and branches to reveal a small, ornate locket. Its surface was tarnished, but I could make out the faint engraving of a rose on its front. I picked it up and opened it, revealing a faded photograph of a young woman. Her face was delicate and serene, her eyes gazing out with an expression of quiet strength. "Elliot," I called, holding up the locket. "Look at this." He joined me, taking the locket from my hands and examining it closely. "This belonged to someone," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Someone who was here." "Do you think it's connected to the victims?" I asked. "It's possible," Elliot said, slipping the locket into his satchel. But it's also possible it was left here intentionally. Another message. For us, I asked, my stomach tightening. For anyone who comes looking, Elliot replied. Let's go. We've seen enough for now. We made our way back through the swamp, the weight of our discoveries pressing down on us with every step. The shadows seemed to stretch longer now, the sounds of the swamp growing louder, more insistent. It felt as though the swamp itself was trying to push us out, to keep us from uncovering its secrets. When we reached the car, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Elliot remained silent as he slid into the driver's seat, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. The drive back to town was quiet, the tension between us palpable. As we pulled into the inn's gravel parking lot, Elliot finally spoke. We're close, he said, his voice low. But whatever we're chasing, it's closer. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The darkness of Blackwater Creek was closing in, and we were running out of time to find the light. The first thing I noticed as we returned to Blackwater Creek under the pale light of dawn was how quiet it was. The oppressive hum of insects and the calls of unseen creatures had faded into an eerie stillness, as if the swamp itself was holding its breath. It wasn't the comforting silence of solitude. It was the kind that prickled the skin, a hush that hinted at something watching, waiting. Elliot was already moving, his steps deliberate as he traced the edge of the swamp with his sharp, calculating gaze. His leather satchel hung at his side, ready for whatever clues the day might throw his way. I followed close behind, the damp air sticking to my skin and filling my lungs with the musty, earthy scent of decay and stagnant water. You feel it, don't you? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot glanced at me but said nothing, his expression unreadable. He was always like this before a breakthrough. Silent, coiled, his mind working faster than his words could keep up with. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the fragment of fabric we'd found the day before, holding it up to the faint morning light. Cotton, he murmured almost to himself. Worn, frayed, but old. It wasn't a revelation, we'd already established that much. But there was a weight in his tone that made me uneasy. I wondered what connections he was making, what invisible threads he was tying together as we stood there in the shadow of the swamp. We pressed on, the ground beneath our feet growing softer, sucking at our shoes with each step. The towering cypress trees loomed overhead, their gnarled roots twisting and tangling like the swamp's very veins. Somewhere nearby, water dripped steadily, the sound echoing in the otherwise suffocating quiet. It wasn't long before we came across something new. Elliot stopped suddenly, crouching low to the ground as his eyes darted toward a patch of disturbed earth near the base of a tree. I joined him, my pulse quickening as I realized what he was looking at. Footprints. 2 sets, Elliot said, his voice clipped but steady. One larger, heavier boots, the other smaller, barefoot. He traced the path with his finger, the lines intersecting and overlapping like a chaotic dance. The larger prints were deep, forceful, as though whoever they belonged to had been dragging something or someone along behind them. The locket? I said suddenly, the image of the tarnished rose flashing through my mind. Do you think it belonged to her? Elliot didn't answer, but the tightness in his jaw told me everything I needed to know. He straightened, his eyes scanning the shadows between the trees, and then set off down the trail without another word. I followed, my breath catching in my throat as the trail led us deeper into the heart of the swamp, where the light struggled to reach and the air grew colder, heavier. The footprints eventually led us to a clearing we hadn't seen before, its center dominated by a wide, shallow pool of dark water. The surface was perfectly still, reflecting the twisted canopy above like a black mirror. At the edge of the pool stood a crude wooden structure, its frame sagging with age and neglect. It might have been a shack once, but now it was little more than a skeletal remnant of its former self. Elliot approached it cautiously, his steps slow and deliberate. The boards creaked and groaned beneath his weight as he stepped inside, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light filtering through the warped slats. I hung back, the unease in my chest tightening like a vice as I scanned the clearing for any sign of movement. "Miguel," Elliot called from inside the shack, his voice sharp and urgent. "Come see this." I hesitated for a moment before stepping forward, the wooden planks creaking ominously beneath my feet as I crossed the threshold. Inside, the air was thick and stale, carrying with it a sickly metallic tang that made my stomach turn. Elliot was crouched near the far corner of the shack, his attention fixed on something half buried in the dirt. I moved to his side and felt my breath catch as I saw what he'd uncovered. Bones. Human bones. "Jesus," I muttered, my voice barely audible. Elliot didn't respond. He was focused, his hands moving methodically as he brushed away the dirt and debris to reveal more of the remains. The bones were old, their surfaces stained and weathered by time, but there was no mistaking their origin. "This was a grave," Elliot said finally, his voice low but steady. "Whoever buried her here didn't want her to be found." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "But why bury her here?" I asked. "Why not somewhere deeper, where no one would stumble across it?" Elliot straightened, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the confines of the shack. "Because they wanted her to be found eventually," he said, "but only when they were ready." I didn't know what to say to that, so I stayed silent, watching as he carefully photographed and documented the site. The air in the shack felt heavier now, pressing down on my chest like a weight, and I was suddenly desperate to get out. Elliot must have sensed my unease because he gestured for me to step outside while he finished his work. I didn't argue. The moment I crossed the threshold and felt the open air against my skin, I took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to steady the pounding in my chest. The clearing was unchanged, but it felt different now, as if the discovery in the shack had altered something fundamental about the place. I walked to the edge of the pool and gazed down at the water, its surface still and dark, revealing nothing of what lay beneath. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a flicker of movement just below the surface, but when I blinked, it was gone. Elliot joined me a few minutes later, his expression grim. "We'll need to report this to the sheriff," he said, though I could tell he wasn't looking forward to it. "Do you think he'll even care?" I asked bitterly. "He'll care," Elliot replied, "whether he wants to or not." We left the clearing in silence, retracing our steps through the swamp with the weight of what we'd found pressing down on us like a physical force. The swamp seemed quieter now, as if it was waiting to see what we would do next. When we finally reached the car, I let out a long breath and leaned against the door, the cold metal grounding me as my mind raced. Elliot was already making plans, his voice calm and steady as he outlined our next steps, but I could feel the storm gathering in his words. Blackwater Creek had given up one of its secrets, but I knew it had more to hide. And as much as I didn't want to admit it, I was afraid of what we might find when we dug deeper. The night pressed down on Blackwater Creek with a suffocating intensity, as if the swamp itself was reluctant to give up the secrets hidden in its depths. Elliot and I made our way through the town's darkened streets under the pale glow of a crescent moon. The air was still, the usual cacophony of insects and night birds reduced to an eerie hush. Even the wind seemed hesitant, brushing past us in half-hearted whispers before retreating into silence. Elliot walked a step ahead of me, his shoulders taut and his movements sharper than usual. I could tell he was on edge, though he didn't show it outwardly. He never did. But there was something in the way his eyes flicked toward every shadow and the deliberate pace of his stride that spoke volumes. I stayed close, my own nerves frayed from the events of the past few days. The swamp had revealed just enough of its darkness to keep us chasing answers, but not enough to make sense of it all. Not yet. Our destination loomed ahead. The abandoned church on the outskirts of town, its spire crooked and sagging like a skeleton's finger pointing toward the heavens. Its once white walls were now streaked with grime, and its windows, long since shattered, gaped like hollow eyes. The townsfolk whispered about the church, saying it had been cursed ever since its congregation vanished decades ago. They didn't say it outright, but I could hear the unspoken truth in their voices. The swamp had claimed it, just as it had claimed so much else. Elliot paused at the edge of the churchyard, his gaze fixed on the building's dark silhouette. "The key lies here," he said quietly, more to himself than to me. "I can feel it." I didn't respond. Instead, I followed him through the overgrown grass, the blades whispering against my boots like 1,000 tiny voices. The air grew heavier the closer we got, thick with the scent of mildew and damp earth. By the time we reached the church's front steps, my breath felt labored, as if the swamp itself was wrapping invisible fingers around my throat. Elliot pushed open the heavy wooden door, its hinges groaning in protest. The darkness inside was almost palpable, swallowing the faint moonlight that trickled through the broken windows. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a flashlight, the beam cutting through the shadows to reveal rows of crumbling pews and a pulpit draped in cobwebs. "Stay close," he said, his voice low but firm. "We don't know what we're walking into." I nodded, though the unease settling in my chest made it hard to speak. We moved deeper into the church, our footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that coated the floor. The air was colder here, tinged with a faint metallic scent that made my stomach churn. It reminded me of the shack, of the bones we'd uncovered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something we weren't prepared for. Elliot's flashlight swept across the walls, revealing faded murals of angels and saints. Their faces were cracked and peeling, their once gentle expressions warped into something that felt almost accusatory. At the far end of the room, near the pulpit, the beam of light caught on something glinting in the darkness. "There," Elliot said, his voice sharpening with focus. We approached cautiously, the floor creaking beneath our weight. As we drew closer, I saw what had caught his attention: an ornate dagger resting atop a makeshift altar. The blade was long and slender, its surface etched with strange symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the light. The hilt was wrapped in dark leather, worn smooth by years of use. "This is it," Elliot said, reaching for the dagger. "This is what ties everything together." "Careful," I warned, though I wasn't sure why. The sight of the dagger filled me with a sense of dread that I couldn't explain. Elliot picked up the weapon, turning it over in his hands as he examined it. His expression was unreadable, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the hilt just a little too tightly. "It's ceremonial," he said finally. "Used in rituals, sacrifices, likely. This is what they've been using." "They?" I echoed, my voice barely above a whisper. "You think there's more than one person involved?" Elliot's eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze. "There has to be," he said. "One person couldn't orchestrate something this elaborate. The rituals, the bodies, the fear, it's all too calculated." Before I could respond, a sound echoed through the church, low and guttural, like the growl of a wounded animal. My heart leapt into my throat as I spun around, searching the shadows for the source. Elliot's flashlight darted toward the noise, illuminating nothing but empty pews and cracked plaster. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Elliot nodded, his grip tightening on the dagger. "We're not alone." The growl came again, closer this time. It was followed by the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and far heavier than our own. My pulse raced as the flashlight's beam swept across the room, finally landing on a figure standing in the doorway. It was tall and cloaked in shadow, its features obscured by a tattered black hood. The air seemed to grow colder as it stepped forward, its movements unnaturally fluid, almost as if it were gliding rather than walking. "Who are you?" Elliot demanded, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised one hand, revealing a charm identical to the one we'd found in the swamp. The sight of it sent a jolt of fear through me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen it somewhere before. Long before this case had brought us to Blackwater Creek. Elliot took a step forward, the dagger still in his hand. "What do you want?" he pressed. The figure remained silent, but its presence was answer enough. The oppressive weight in the air grew unbearable, pressing down on my chest and making it hard to breathe. The room seemed to darken, the shadows creeping closer as if drawn to the figure's presence. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure turned and vanished into the night, leaving us alone in the suffocating silence of the church. Elliot lowered the dagger, his shoulders sagging slightly as the tension began to ease. "We need to move," he said, his voice low but urgent. "Whatever that was, it's not finished with us." I nodded, though my legs felt like lead as I followed him back out into the night. The air outside was sharp and cool, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the church. As we made our way back to the car, the weight of the dagger in Elliot's hand seemed to grow heavier with each step. Blackwater Creek wasn't finished with us yet, and neither was whatever darkness had taken root here, hidden beneath the surface and waiting for the right moment to strike. The air in Blackwater Creek felt heavier than ever, as if the very ground beneath us knew what we were getting closer to. Elliot had barely spoken since our encounter in the church, his mind undoubtedly unraveling the threads of the mystery. I wasn't sure what to make of what we'd seen. The figure, the dagger, the oppressive weight of something unseen lingering in that place. Fear and logic warred inside me, and I wasn't sure which would win. All I knew was that we couldn't stop now. Elliot had insisted on returning to the sheriff's office to examine the dagger under proper lighting. Sheriff McAllister was visibly uneasy when we walked in, his usual gruff exterior giving way to a nervous energy that I found unsettling. "What you got now?" McAllister asked, eyeing the dagger as Elliot placed it on his desk with meticulous care. "Something pivotal," Elliot replied evenly. "Do you recognize this?" The sheriff leaned in, his brow furrowing as his eyes scanned the blade. He seemed to pale slightly, but he covered it with a scoff. "Looks like some old relic. What, you think it's tied to all this?" "It is," Elliot said sharply, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "And I believe you've seen something like it before." McAllister's gaze darted to me, then back to Elliot. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "You do," Elliot countered, his eyes narrowing. "If you keep withholding information, Sheriff, more lives could be at risk." The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with the very dagger that lay between them. McAllister exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. "Fine," he said at last, his voice low. "There's a legend about that blade. The old-timers used to talk about it. Said it belonged to a coven that practiced dark rituals out in the swamp. They called it the Throat of Shadows. Supposedly, it was used in sacrifices to bind spirits to this world." Elliot exchanged a glance with me before pressing further. "And where exactly did this coven practice?" McAllister hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the window as if expecting something, or someone, to be watching. "There's a place," he said finally, "deep in the swamp. Folks call it the Hollow. But you don't want to go there. Nobody who goes ever comes back the same." "We don't have a choice," Elliot said, his voice firm. "Tell us how to get there." The sheriff sighed heavily, scribbling a rough map on a piece of paper. "Follow the old logging trail past the creek," he said. "When you see the willow tree with the broken branch, head east. You'll know you're close when the air gets colder." The trail to the hollow was as harrowing as I'd feared. The swamp seemed almost alive, its gnarled roots reaching out to trip us, its shadows shifting in ways that defied logic. The air grew colder with each step, just as McAllister had warned, and a strange mist began to curl around our feet, muffling our footsteps and distorting the world around us. Elliot led the way, his flashlight cutting through the gloom, its beam revealing flashes of glistening water and the occasional flicker of movement. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, though every time I turned, I saw nothing but the tangled swamp. "Do you feel that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot nodded without looking back. "We're close." The trees parted suddenly, revealing a clearing unlike any we'd seen before. At its center stood a circle of jagged stones, each one etched with symbols similar to those on the dagger. The ground was bare, the soil black and cracked as if scorched by some unnatural force. The air was frigid now, our breath visible in the faint light of the moon. "This is it," Elliot said quietly. He moved to the circle, his movements careful, almost reverent. I stayed at the edge, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. As Elliot examined the stones, I noticed something glinting near the center of the circle. It was another dagger, identical to the one we'd found in the church, its blade buried deep in the ground. Elliot knelt beside it, his gloved hands brushing away the dirt to reveal more of the symbols. "These markings," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "They're not just decorative. They're instructions." "For what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Elliot didn't answer. Instead, he pulled the dagger free and examined it closely. The air seemed to grow heavier, the silence around us deepening until even the sound of my own breathing felt muffled. And then, without warning, the ground beneath us trembled. "What's happening?" I shouted, my voice echoing unnaturally in the stillness. Elliot stood, his eyes scanning the clearing. "Something's coming," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "Stay close." The mist thickened, rising like a living thing, curling around the stones and obscuring the edges of the clearing. The temperature plummeted further, my breath now coming out in ragged clouds. And then, through the haze, I saw them. Figures emerging from the mist, their shapes indistinct but undeniably human. They moved slowly, deliberately, their faces hidden beneath hoods of tattered black fabric. In their hands, they carried charms like the ones we'd found in the swamp, the bones and twine glinting faintly in the dim light. "Who are they?" I asked, my voice shaking. "The Coven," Elliot replied, his voice steady. He gripped the dagger tightly, his eyes never leaving the figures. "They're trying to finish what they started." The figures stopped at the edge of the circle, their presence heavy and oppressive. One of them stepped forward, raising a hand in a gesture that seemed both commanding and beckoning. Elliot didn't move, his posture rigid, his eyes locked on the figure. "What do you want?" he demanded. The figure tilted its head, the motion slow and deliberate. When it spoke, its voice was low and hollow, like wind through a graveyard. "To protect what is ours." "This ends here," Elliot said firmly, his grip on the dagger tightening. "No more sacrifices, no more fear." The figure didn't respond, but the air around us seemed to ripple with an unseen force. The other figures began to move, closing in on the circle, their forms shifting and twisting in the mist. I felt a surge of panic rising in my chest, but Elliot's voice cut through it. "Hold your ground, Miguel," he said, his tone commanding. "We're not running." I nodded, though my hands trembled as I reached for the small knife I carried. The figures grew closer, their shapes becoming more defined, their presence more overwhelming. And then, just as they reached the edge of the circle, they stopped. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. And then, without warning, the lead figure raised its hand, and the mist surged forward like a living wave. Elliot moved swiftly, stepping into the circle and driving the dagger into the ground with a force that sent a shockwave rippling through the air. The mist recoiled, the figures stumbling back as if struck. The symbols on the stones began to glow faintly, their light cutting through the darkness like a beacon. The figures hesitated, their movements unsteady, and then, one by one, they retreated into the mist. The air grew still once more, the oppressive weight lifting as the clearing returned to silence. Elliot straightened, his breathing heavy, his eyes scanning the clearing for any remaining threats. "It's not over," he said quietly, his voice resolute. "But this is a start." I nodded, my pulse still racing as I looked out into the now empty swamp. The darkness of Blackwater Creek had been pushed back, if only for a moment. But I knew, as Elliot did, that it wasn't finished with us yet. The sky above Blackwater Creek was painted in streaks of bruised violet, as though the swamp had absorbed the grief of the years and pressed it into the clouds. Elliot stood by the car, leaning against the hood as he read over the map the sheriff had given us once more. His expression was sharp, calculating, yet there was something else beneath the surface, a quiet intensity that hadn't been there before. "We go deeper this time," Elliot said, his voice low, almost like a command. His eyes didn't leave the lines of the map. "The hollow's where this ends." I nodded, gripping the strap of the bag slung over my shoulder. Inside, The ceremonial dagger from the clearing rested among a handful of tools and notepads. Though its weight was negligible, it felt heavy as lead in my mind, dragging me down with the questions it carried. Who were they? What were they trying to keep locked away, or worse, summon? The swamp was a labyrinth of uncertainty as we drove toward the edge of town. The road turned into dirt and then barely a road at all, as the terrain thickened with the roots of cypress trees that twisted and clawed upward like gnarled hands. Mist unfurled around us, thin at first, but thickening as we drove deeper. The headlights of the car bounced uselessly off the pale fog, making Elliot stop the car with a sharp hiss of brakes. "We walk the rest of the way," he said, grabbing his flashlight before slamming the door shut behind him. The smell of damp earth and moss wrapped around us as we descended into the swamp's suffocating stillness. The mud beneath our feet sucked at our boots with every step, as if the swamp itself didn't want us to proceed. The sheriff's hand-drawn map crumpled slightly in Elliot's hands. The faint ink marks a reminder of how vague the directions had been. He moved steadily forward, his flashlight beam flickering across the mist, illuminating only patches of tangled roots and brackish water. "Do you trust McAllister's directions?" I asked, stepping lightly to avoid sinking too far into the muck. "I trust that he's terrified," Elliot replied without looking back. "And fear sharpens truth better than any confession." The deeper we moved, the quieter the swamp grew. No croaks from the hidden frogs, no hum of cicadas. The absence of sound was deafening, and it gnawed at my thoughts like a dull blade. I gripped the strap of my bag tighter, the edges of the dagger wrapped in cloth pressing uncomfortably into my hip. Then we saw it, the willow tree McAllister had described. Its massive trunk stood crooked like a sentinel at the edge of a narrow path, its heavy branches cascading down to obscure the trail beyond. One branch was split in two, jagged and blackened at its break. Without a word, Elliot adjusted the beam of his flashlight and passed beneath the tree's hanging canopy, his pace steady. I followed, forcing myself to ignore the shudder that ran down my spine. We emerged into a clearing shrouded in fog and shadow. The ground here was firmer, dry in patches but scarred with strange symbols etched into the dirt. The lines swirled and intersected in a chaotic language I couldn't decipher, but their purpose was unmistakable. This was a ritual site. At its center stood a stone altar, worn by time but stained in ways that time could never erase. Beside it, a figure stood waiting, my breath caught in my throat. The figure was draped in a tattered black cloak, its hood obscuring its face. It clutched a staff carved with the same symbols that marred the ground. The wood darkened and slick as though it had absorbed the swamp's essence. Elliot didn't slow. He stepped forward with the calm precision of a man who had faced down far worse than shadows and secrets. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the fog like a blade. "And what is this place?" The figure tilted its head ever so slightly, as if studying him. When it spoke, its voice was raspy, layered with something unearthly that crawled under my skin. "You are too late," it said, the words echoing as though spoken from far away. "The binding has begun." "What binding?" Elliot pressed, his flashlight steady on the figure. "Who are you binding and why?" The figure raised a hand slowly, and in its palm rested a charm, identical to the one we'd seen before, a twisted configuration of bone and twine. "They seek what should not be sought," it said. "The shadows demand a price." As the words left its mouth, the ground beneath us trembled. The symbols carved into the earth began to glow faintly, their light pulsating like a heartbeat. The fog thickened, swirling inward toward the altar. My chest tightened as the air grew cold, colder than anything I'd felt in my life. "Elliot," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need to leave." But Elliot's focus never wavered. He stepped closer, the flashlight beam steady as it illuminated the figure's hood. "No," he said firmly. "This ends here. Tell me how to stop it." The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised the staff and struck it against the altar. The glow from the symbols flared bright, blinding for an instant, and the tremors in the ground intensified. A sound rose from the earth, a deep, guttural moan that reverberated through my bones. From the shadows, more figures began to emerge. They moved slowly, deliberately, their tattered cloaks blending with the mist until it was impossible to tell where the fabric ended and the fog began. They formed a circle around us, their presence suffocating. Elliot pulled the ceremonial dagger from his bag and raised it in front of him. "This is your tool," he said, his voice commanding. "Tell me how to undo what you've done." The lead figure finally lowered its hood, revealing a face weathered by time and scarred with the same symbols that marked the earth. Its eyes burned with an unnatural light, piercing and inhuman. "There is no undoing," it said. "Only sacrifice." Before I could react, the glow from the ground surged upward, forming tendrils of light that writhed and twisted like living things. They reached for us, their touch cold and searing at once. I stumbled back, my hand instinctively going to the small knife at my side, though it felt utterly inadequate against whatever was happening. Elliot didn't falter. He stepped into the circle of light, his movements precise as he drove the dagger into the earth at the center of the altar. The light flickered, the tendrils recoiling briefly as though in pain. The figures around us let out a collective hiss, their shapes flickering like shadows cast by an unsteady flame. The lead figure raised its staff once more, but Elliot was faster. He twisted the dagger, and the light surged outward in a blinding wave. The figures screamed, their forms disintegrating into mist as the light consumed them. The ground beneath us shuddered violently, the symbols cracking and fading into nothingness. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The fog lifted, the air warming as the oppressive weight of the swamp seemed to ease. The clearing was silent, the altar now nothing more than a crumbling stone relic. Elliot knelt by the dagger, his shoulders rising and falling as he caught his breath. I moved to his side, my legs shaky but steady enough to support me. "Did we stop it?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Elliot pulled the dagger free and examined it. The symbols etched into the blade had faded, their power seemingly spent. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "For now," he said. We left the clearing in silence, the swamp's shadows no longer feeling quite so menacing. But deep down, I knew the darkness we'd faced wasn't gone. It had simply retreated, waiting for the next time someone dared to disturb it.